Hello and welcome to tonight's second great debate here at Queen's University Belfast Literary and Scientific Society, the Literific. We're the official debating society here at the Queen's University of Belfast, and we're really excited to introduce tonight's debate, which is This House Supports No Platforming. We've got some amazing guests who have all agreed to debate within the rules that have been laid out for tonight's debate. We're excited to introduce them. The debate rules have been agreed by everyone participating in tonight's debate. But before we get on to introducing our guests, I'd just like to thank the Council of the Society, all the members that have been involved in organising tonight's debate, and all the students as well that support us every night of every Thursday night of every week in normal term time. So to introduce our guests for tonight's debate. Our first guest that we'd like to introduce is Afroze Fatima Zaidi. She is the weekend editor at The Canary. Our second guest we've got to introduce tonight is Claire Fox, the director of the Institute of Ideas and a member of the House of Lords. A third guest who sadly can't be with us in tonight's debate but has sent through a online video pre-recorded speech is Kate O'Brien, who is a disability rights activist and who holds a master's in human rights law. Our fourth guest that we'd like to introduce in tonight's debate is Jamie Bryson, who is the editor of Unionist Voice, author of Brexit Betrayal. And last but not least, our fifth guest in tonight's debate is Ella Whelan, who is a journalist and commentator and author of What Women Want. Alongside our guests in tonight's debate, we do have student speakers who will be debating as well. They are Matthew Sullivan, Umar Ziam, James Hadnett, Ciara Swail, and Keir Crozier. Feel free during tonight's debate to comment on the live stream any questions you may have. They will be relayed to me and asked at the end of the debate. Feel free to comment as well and really do get involved with the topic that we're discussing tonight. So, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, who will introduce tonight's case for the proposition in the debate, who is Matthew Sullivan, our very own Secretary of the Society. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Matt. So, in my speech tonight, I'm going to be giving a quick overview of what no platforming is, giving some examples of who are and are not no platformed, talk about why private organizations should have a right to refuse a platform to speakers, and talk about how this does not, as the opposition might suggest, constitute a violation of their right to freedom of expression. My colleagues are going to go into more detail about why debating people like these doesn't actually result in their ideas losing traction, and in fact usually gives them more supporters, and expand on how no platforming an individual does not violate their right to freedom of expression. So I'd like to begin by explaining what no platforming actually means. In the context of universities, it refers to a National Union of Students policy that no speaker who holds racist or fascist viewpoints should speak at an SU event or enter SU premises. That is, you won't get no platform from a student event for being a Tory or a unionist, but you will get no platform for vocally supporting fascist groups like the English Defence League or the British National Party. To give some more examples, people who would not be no platformed include Arlene Foster, Gerry Adams, David Cameron, or Theresa May, whereas people who are explicitly no platformed by the NUS include Tony Robinson, former leader of the fascist English Defence League, Omar Bakri Mohammed, founder of the Salafi jihadist group Al-Muhajirun, and members of National Action, a neo-Nazi terrorist organization. To reiterate, SU no platform policies in universities are not used as a tool to shut down any form of debate. If they were, then our society probably would have been banned years ago. It's not used to shut down any speaker who holds right-wing viewpoints either. The NUS policy on no platforming only asks that affiliated students' unions do not let fascists or racists use SU resources to spread their ideologies. And it's not like it's forced on them either. They're also very clear that any SU can have any no platforming policy they want, or even just have none. Aside from university students' unions, no platforming more broadly refers to the idea that private organizations should be allowed to refuse a platform to those whose views they hold to be abhorrent, such as aforementioned terrorists and neo-Nazis. Platforming somebody in this context means to allow them to use your resources to spread their ideas. Now, I believe that private individuals and organizations should not be compelled to platform anybody. If I own a microphone, I don't believe the government should be allowed to force me to allow a literal fascist or supporter of terrorism to use my microphone to spread their hateful ideology. The same goes for any resource, be it a stage or students' union building or even a meeting of a debating society. The opposition tonight is going to try and sell you the idea that a private organization refusing to platform a fascist is somehow violating that fascist's right to freedom of expression. But I don't buy that for a second, and you shouldn't either. This isn't a case of the government restricting what these people can say or publish. This is a case of private organizations not being compelled to facilitate the spread of ideas that they consider to be abhorrent. If an organization is not allowed to refuse a platform to somebody, then consider what that actually means. On the opposition side, a fascist or a terrorist supporter can demand that a university students' union let them spread their ideology to students. A hardline dissident Republican can demand that a unionist organization let them stand up and speak in support of the IRA. A hardline dissident loyalist can demand that a nationalist organization let them stand up and speak in support of the UVF. Make no mistake, when these organizations exercise their right to not allow these individuals to speak, they are no platforming those individuals, and I absolutely support their right to do so. Nobody should be forced to facilitate the spread of ideas which they consider to be abhorrent, and to do so would be to violate their right to freedom from compelled speech. On to my final point, why no platforming does not constitute a violation of the right to freedom of expression. The right to freedom of expression or freedom of speech is often misinterpreted, intentionally or not, by people who want to say things that are controversial or offensive. So to clear things up, I'm going to give an overview of what the right to freedom of expression actually means. The actual definition of this right, as stated in Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights ratified by the UK, is as follows. Everybody has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. There's also a second part that essentially places caveats about things that are not protected speech, like you can't spread hate speech or break professional confidentiality or insinuate without proof that certain people belong to certain terrorist organizations, but that's less relevant here. What I specifically want to call out in that article is that it only restricts what a public authority can stop you from saying, that is, the government. Private organizations have every right to refuse to let you speak for any reason they want. No platforming, therefore, does not violate the right to freedom of expression. It is simply the right of a private organization to refuse you access to their resources. It is, in fact, simply them exercising their right to freedom from compelled speech, because nobody should be compelled to publish or facilitate the promotion of an ideology or idea which they find abhorrent, especially ideas so abhorrent as fascism, racism, or the advocation of terrorist actions. These speakers are still absolutely free to publish these ideas using their own resources or using the resources of organizations which align with them, as they do. To conclude, I've explained what no platforming actually means. I've given some examples of how no platforming is not used as a sledgehammer to restrict right-wing thought. I've explained why private organizations have the right to refuse to platform individuals, and I have explained why no platforming does not constitute a violation of anybody's right to freedom of expression. Do not be fooled by the opposition's claims that they are promoting freedom. They are, in fact, denying the freedom of people and of private organizations to refuse to spread ideas of hate and evil. I urge you to side with the proposition tonight and support the right of private individuals and organizations to no platform, to refuse access to resources, to organizations and individuals who spread ideas that they believe to be abhorrent. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew Sullivan, for that speech. And now we go to the first speaker for the opposition to introduce the opposition's argument in tonight's debate, Umar Ziam.
Thank you, Mr. President, and may I thank the Literific for putting in the hard work to organise this very important debate. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, we on the opposition are simply here to make the case, what we believe to be a complete no-brainer in a liberal democracy, and especially in a university, namely to make a case for the principle of free speech and to oppose a principle which we believe to be completely antithetical to all that our society and our country stands for. Mr. President, we do not believe, I doubt anyone else on the proposition believes, that private organizations should be forced to platform or deplatform certain speakers. We simply are here to speak against the principle that they should be no platformed for holding certain beliefs or expressing certain views. Setting aside that freedom of speech is one of the most important, if not, and one of the most fundamental, if not the most fundamental rights and liberties in a liberal democracy, we ask you to question what the policy of no platforming is meant to achieve. What implications would it have on the nature of public debate should it be allowed to prevail? What effect would it have on extremist ideas in our society? Besides the obvious limitations on free speech, namely an incitement to violence or criminality, we ask how stifling free speech to the extent that the motion proposes would serve our liberal democratic society. It is often argued by those who support the motion that no platforming is a method of countering extremist ideas and supporting progressive ones. But I ask, what better way of doing so than through the mode of free public discourse and debate? When the leader of the British National Party, a dubious character known for his less than tasteful views by the name of Nick Griffin, appeared on the popular BBC talk show Question Time, it was asked why on earth the BBC would have on their programme such a vile and hateful man. However, when Mr. Griffin appeared on Question Time and had his views subjected to the rigours of public debate, his party's popularity and his hateful message were ripped to shreds. Mr. Griffin and his party, having garnered over 1 million votes and being an MEP, being a member of the European Parliament, went to being sidelined into obscurity, having his views exposed and torn apart in the platform
on that point,
public debate. No, thank you. I would therefore, ladies and gentlemen, ask you to consider the dangers that no platforming would cause. What would happen if such dangerous and extremist ideas as those held by Nick Griffin were allowed to spread and fester, untested, unchecked by the rigours of public debate? It is perhaps a matter of great irony that those who support the cause of no platforming would actually consider themselves progressive and would actually stifle the very freedom that allowed for that progress which they espouse as their own to come to pass, using the same tactics as those who opposed progress to stifle it. Think of how offensive it was when to many people of the Catholic faith when Galileo Galilei shattered the Copernican astronomical consensus at the time that the sun was at the center of the universe and defied the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. How offensive would it have been at one point in this very part of the world to demand the emancipation of Catholics and equal rights for Irish Catholics? How offensive would it have been in Victorian society, Edwardian society, to demand universal suffrage and indeed to many, many people around the world at the time? How offensive would it have been to argue not even 100 years ago that the persecution of homosexuals and the lawful sanctions imposed against them, such as imprisonment and basically mental torture, was inhumane? How offensive would it have been for Martin Luther King in the 1960s to have marched in Selma, Alabama, demanding equal civil rights for African Americans?
On that
All
point,
these social movements that I've mentioned would have been met with the most strongly felt offence and calls to no platform or even imprison the people who supported these causes, as in the case of Martin Luther King and Galileo. At the very heart of this debate appears to be a stark disagreement as to what it means to give someone a platform. Those of the no platforming disposition appear to be of the notion that a platform is some sort of endorsement of a person's entire character. However, allowing this principle would fundamentally debase the very purpose which is of debate, which is fundamentally to do with points of disagreement. It would effectively turn a debate into some strange head-nodding contest where no serious points or contentious points are made and no real disagreements are had.
On that point,
Therefore, be made clear, no thank you, that a platform is foremost a test of ideas and character rather than an endorsement of it. On the opposition of this very debate, we have Baroness Claire Fox, a former member of the Revolutionary Communist Party who has been criticised for her stance on the IRA. She speaks alongside Jamie Bryson, a loyalist activist whose views and activities have been heavily criticised in Northern Ireland. We have also Ella Whelan, a left-wing journalist for the Spiked, who debates alongside myself and Keir Crozier, both members of the diabolical evil Tory party. However, we have put our views aside and our convictions aside on this occasion to back a common cause, which we believe to be of vital significance to our society. It is also worth noting that a crucial aspect of public debate and discourse is further debased by the misguided idiocy of no platforming, namely that of the audience and the general public and individuals to make up their own minds on a controversial issue. If an idea is objectionable, it should surely follow that those objections should be made publicly so that individuals may retort and make their own minds up regarding an issue. It would seem that the proponents of no platforming have the view of the audience as though they're a group of pre-programmed robots who would simply be brainwashed if exposed to bad ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, cannot be trusted to hear extremist ideas. You might be turned into fascists or Nazis. The amount of credit given to the conscience and intelligence of the audience and the public's ignorant at best and deeply condescending at worst. The opposition, ladies and gentlemen, is on the in this debate is on the side of and places faith foremost in your ability to be able to hear and think for yourselves and determine for yourselves what is right and what is wrong. As for the argument made by some that some ideas are too offensive or too hurtful to be heard by members of the public, and especially minority groups, what could be more condescending to minorities to tell them that they're too weak and feeble and too emotional to hear arguments, to hear opinions that might cause them emotional distress? What could be more feeble? What could be more condescending? Mr. President, we on the opposition are here to defend one of the most hard-won and precious liberties that we have as human beings and as citizens of a liberal democracy. On that point, I beg leave to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Umar Ziam there. Now it turns to me to introduce our second speaker for the proposition to continue the case for the proposition in tonight's debate, Afroze Fatima Zaidi. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone thank you to the speakers for introducing the debate. It's interesting for me to hear these arguments as somebody who is, who belongs to multiple minority communities. I think the first point that I would like to make, from that standpoint, is that freedom of speech, people speak about it as though it is some kind of, universal right when actually the distribution or the availability of freedom of speech has never really been equitable in the first place. There have always been differences in how available freedom of speech is to any particular individual. So what we need to take into account is the power relations that are at play in our society, and the fact that more often than not, people who complain about being silenced because they're being no platformed, they come from a place in society where actually, removing a platform from them is not equal to silencing them. And they have, even if they are no platformed on occasion, they still have greater freedom of speech than someone like me or someone from a marginalized community would have. So I think it's quite important to, take that into account.
On that point?
No, thank you. So freedom of speech is not something that is equitably available, and neither are platforms, for that matter. You see, for instance, the BBC and how often they've hosted Nigel Farage. Even they continue to do so despite the fact that he is no longer a member of the European Parliament. He's not an MP, and he still somehow seems to have a say in everything to do with British politics. Like, who are you? Why do you still have a say? And it's not, when you compare it to, somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, he's not considered a political commentator. No, thank you. In the same way that Nigel Farage is, in the same way that even Tony Blair is, he's not given a platform in that same way. He's not, given access to mainstream outlets, to mainstream media. And in fact, when we look at the, December 2019 election, actually, there was a very sustained campaign of vilification against Jeremy Corbyn, and there's been research done about this. This is not something that's a point of argument. So platforms, again, are not something that are equitably available. They're not something that is, it's not something that everyone has access to. And therefore, having a platform is a privilege. It's not a privilege that is available to everybody. And, no platforming, also, it's important, I think the point has already been made, but that no platforming is not the same as silencing someone or as taking away someone's freedom of speech, because what it simply means is that a particular institution is saying that we will not, give you the opportunity to propagate your views. That doesn't mean that that person does not have other avenues to do so, So for instance, Steve Bannon came to Oxford Union. This was back in 2018, I think. And at the time there was there was a fair bit of uproar about it. But the debate went ahead. I think it went ahead, they had to beef up security and they had like a limited audience and all kinds of things. And I remember at the time, one of the students defending it saying, oh, I may not agree with his views, but he has a right to speak. Well, he has a right to speak, and he also has like this massive, internet following. He has like other platforms on which he is able to spread his views. But when the Oxford Union hosts him, what they're really saying is that, yes, come. And it's basically a normalization of the kinds of views that Steve Bannon, chief advisor to Trump at one point, supporter of the border wall and so on, and all of the human rights atrocities that are associated with that. It's normalizing those views. And, I think it was the day after the day after the debate that there was a swastika painted on a community center in Oxford, right? So I think the whole way that the media operates at the moment, we don't seem to realize that actually by giving oxygen to these views, by giving prime time, slots to people like Nigel Farage and even Tommy Robinson and, and Steve Bannon, multiple interviews in mainstream outlets for Steve Bannon as well. By giving, airtime to these views, what's happening is that the window of acceptable discourse is shifting ever more to the right, because it's not being counterbalanced by a similar, if you want to equate, for instance, far left and far right, which actually, I don't, and I don't think it's a reasonable comparison, but even if you did, there isn't a similar representation of far left views on media outlets, right? So who actually is it that's being no platformed? Who is it that's being silenced in reality? Yeah. So I think that we need to proceed on the basis that this is the context in which we are talking about no platforming. We are talking about no platforming in the context of increasing normalization of right-wing views, increasing normalization of hatred towards minorities. So I have no problems in supporting the right of organizations, and actually the need for organizations to say to individuals like Steve Bannon and Nigel Farage and Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson that actually your views are not welcome here. Because if they're not saying that, then what they're saying in effect to people like me is that I'm not welcome there, that they don't support my right to exist because they are platforming the views of these people who literally do not support my right to exist. Yeah. So I think we need to think about it in that context. It really frustrates me when people use the word silencing in relation to no platforming, because actually silencing happens anyway. It happens all of the time, but when it happens to people like me, to our communities, nobody notices. The only time that there's an uproar and people start making noise and shouting freedom of speech is when it's white people who are being silenced and far right people who are being, no platformed. MLK was used as an example when MLK, that is just laughable, honestly, because at the time, let me assure you, MLK was Martin Luther King was extensively silenced by the establishment, by the media around him, yeah? To the extent that, with the Muslim community now, because of the pressures of Prevent, it's actually resulted in people, self-censorship and people not being able to share their views on, for instance, things like Palestine, or things, basically views that are critical of the state, because of the fact that Prevent has sort of caused the stranglehold on the freedom of expression of Muslims. Yeah, Muslims that oppose foreign policy, that oppose British foreign policy, Muslims that are, against, who are vocal about, for instance, the UK support of Israel. They are then, flagged up as being potentially at risk of radicalization. So silencing is happening, but what annoys me is that where it really is happening, people don't pay attention and aren't objecting to it. Yeah, so I think that maybe there needs to be a shift in priorities. What I want to end on is that really when we are looking at hosting speakers, I think what we need to look at is in terms of prioritizing of values. The democratic values that were mentioned by the opposition speaker just now, when we decide to host a speaker and we decide to give them a platform, we need to look at which democratic values we are prioritizing. Are we prioritizing the speaker's right to freedom of speech, or do we want to prioritize the right of minorities to safety, the right to have our humanity recognized, our right to practice our religion and to express our sexuality? What about those liberal values, right? And if these liberal values are threatened, then how is freedom of speech, how is someone else's freedom of speech more important than that? Thank you.
Thank you for your speech there. Thank you for that. So now I'll introduce the second speaker for the opposition to continue the case for the opposition, Claire Fox.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Important discussion. I want to start by agreeing with my opponent, Matthew, that private organisations should indeed be free not to give platforms to people should they not want to. I organise an annual festival called the Battle of Ideas, and I'm not obliged to give anyone a speaker. No speaker is entitled to speak, and also, if you're a publisher, you shouldn't feel that you have to publish someone. That's perfectly legitimate. What no platform is about, though, is if somebody's been invited to speak, when there is a kerfuffle caused and they are cancelled, and therefore they've been no platformed. But I think there's a broader problem that we face at the moment, which is that there is an increasing pressure on organisations to not provide platforms for a larger number of people. A more censorious atmosphere that means that private organisations, such as newspapers or publishing houses, are under pressure, even from their own staff, but often because of a very loud and vocal opposition to, for example, featuring certain columnists who have been regular columnists, and then there's calls for them to be sacked or else, or publishing novels. No, thank you. Or publishing novels by people who, for their politics, people have decided should never have a platform. And I think there's a broader atmosphere that chills free speech in terms of the number of topics that are now verboten. Organisers of events such as this worry that if they invite the wrong speaker that is too contentious, that person might be no platformed for being offensive. And so it narrows down who you'd think of inviting. Just to give an example, I was recently asked to speak at a debate by Sussex University on Generation Snowflake. By the time the debate happened, the organisers of the Student Society looked so hassled they'd aged by many years because they'd had to go through so much trouble for inviting some of the speakers. And they drew the conclusion that maybe they'd choose less contentious issues in the future. So whether it's government's prevent policy, which vets speakers and is a chilling impact on who is platformed, and that's mirrored by safe space student activists vetting for who's speaking in case they are hate speakers, then I do think we've got a problem of a greater problem of no platform. It might seem obvious that you'll know which views are hate speech, by the way, but are you sure? We've heard Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins mentioned and various people, but if you're called a racist, should you just be no platform because somebody calls you a racist? I'd object to that because, for example, people who voted Brexit in the EU referendum have been routinely called racist. And therefore, these terms are now so broadly and widely used that you would actually platform very few people. I think this atmosphere turns issues into a toxic issue, and you won't go there. So the categorization of criticism of trans ideas are now called hate speech means that many people will avoid the issue rather than be accused of hate speech. And essentially now there is a blacklist of feminist activists and lesbian activists who are blacklisted from being given a platform because they defend women's rights or because it's just too contentious. I was invited to speak at an international relations event by Oxford University 3 years after the EU referendum. They'd had 8 debates on the issue of leaving the European Union, and I was the first leaver that had spoken at any of those events. And then there was an objection to me being given a platform, and people were outraged that I was there. The reason I'm saying that is because Brexit had become a toxic issue in Oxford University. And although lots of people sidled up to me afterwards, students said I'm secretly a leaver, there had never been a recognition that that issue should be properly debated. And having somebody who had simply voted on the winning side in a referendum was enough to cause a problem. So I think there's a narrow range of views and topics available, and particularly to students. And it's somebody else always who decides what you can hear. So the key for me is less on an emphasis on no platform as a form of censorship that prevents people from speaking, but no platform as a way of preventing audiences from hearing. Thomas Paine wrote in the preface to The Rights of Man, censorship is always more a sentence on the public than the author, and I agree. It's true that open debate is unlikely to persuade your opponents of your side. They're pretty firm in their views. But in public debates, it's not about winning over the opposing speaker. It's about winning over the audience. Is it about defeating ideas that you oppose, holding them up to the light and exposing them to scrutiny, and then winning over the hearts and minds of the public audience? It seems to me then that their justification for no platform shows contempt for the audience and does that through using the language of harm of speech. One argument is that some people's free speech will incite those listening to harm others, as though just by hearing racist views, the audience will uncritically accept them and fall prey to those ideas. And as
On
though
that point?
no, thank you. It's already been explained by one of the earlier speakers that this treats audiences as attack dogs, automatons who are not capable of using their agency to make moral judgments about what's right and wrong. But a broader definition of harm used is to suppress hate speech is that offensive ideas might psychologically harm people. This therapeutic and subjective expansion of J.S. Mill's harm principle concedes of the audience as vulnerable and weak and in need of protection. And this seems a dangerous, diminishing and patronising way of viewing and infantilising student audiences, as though they'll be unable to cope with uncomfortable or contentious speech. And to say that you're doing it especially to protect minority groups is, I find, an egregious view and paternalistic view. So if we are banning somebody, no platforming them to protect women, for example, it treats women as though they need to be looked after, as though they're the weakest sex and incapable of arguing back. I also wonder what it says about no platforms attitudes to audiences, that it assumes the audience members can't be won over to your side of the argument without silencing your opponents. Surely that demonstrates a lack of belief in the strength of one's own arguments, and it's ultimately a conservative position. There's no possibility of changing someone else's mind or being open-minded enough to have your own mind change. So it assumes a status quo. No thanks. Here forever that nothing will change. I know that there was some controversy last year about a debate that you had, your own society, on the decriminalisation of abortion, of inviting Anne Widdecombe to speak. To quote the tab, it said, platforming Anne Widdecombe was an uncomfortable part of the debate due to her track record of untenable and harmful positions that represented only a small minority of socially conservative views. Well, given that so few people share Widdecombe's extreme views on abortion, he went on to say that it would be reckless, as so few supported her, to give her a platform. And I want to ask the no platformers this. Should all minority views be treated as unworthy of a platform, as Anne Widdecombe's was in that editorial? But it's also a reminder that until relatively recently, it was pro-choice ideas that were the minority, and the socially conservative anti-abortion views were those that dominated. How do you think that changed? That changed through debate and convincing the majority of the cause of women's rights. At university, when I was 18, a million years ago, I admit it here, pro-life and anti-abortion. I spoke at a debate and I convinced the majority of the audience to support me, and I won. If it was now, I would have been demonised and no platformed. As it happens, the women's group in the audience decided to approach me after the debate and tried to convince me of their point of view. They recommended books that I should read, and they argued with me. I then spent a very uncomfortable year squirming and toing and froing and struggling with my conscience, trying to decide what to do. And I went as an audience member and listened to lots of debates and thought about it. And eventually, I decided that I wanted to oppose, rather than opposing abortion, and luckily my opponents took me seriously enough and persevered, I became a pro-choice activist and a convert. So I say to you in the audience, are your views now the views that you will have into the decades ahead? Will you always have the same views? Are you open to changing your mind about anything? Isn't that the point of debate? And the wider the platforms there are, the more views you hear, the more likely things will change, society will change. Because otherwise, we're going to have the conservative position of thinking that exactly what you think now is what we will think forevermore. And on that basis, we'd never have fought racism, never have fought slavery, and never have had a majority of people supporting pro-choice views at your university.
Thank you for your speech and contribution in tonight's debate. Now we turn to our third speaker for the proposition, Kate O'Brien, who sadly couldn't be with us live tonight, but has sent in a pre-recorded speech. So there will be no interjections during the speech, but her views will be heard and will be part of the debate. So I'll do that now.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've had a lot of debates on this topic, but usually in a more casual setting. The subject tends to provoke strong opinions one way or the other. For many years now, I've been convinced that deplatforming, for example, misogynists, racists, and fascists, is not just advisable, but a moral imperative. This view has not always been popular. That said, my opinions on the topic were considered far more radical pre-2021 and the swarming of the American Capitol, which was considered to have been encouraged online by the erstwhile President of the United States, Donald Trump. Before that event, I think some people didn't realize that the internet was part of real life. They thought it was this liminal space where people could be weird and violent, but didn't take it home, as it were. Or were just this weird niche that you'd never meet in reality. January proved, at least to politicians, what many denizens of the internet already knew. The violence on the internet is real, and that words matter. Firstly, what do I mean when I say deplatforming? I mean a general recognition that we should not give a platform to people with views that are considered abhorrent or ridiculous, or to people peddling dangerous misinformation. Deplatforming is not a legal stance. It is not about the law. It is a social agreement to not promote or fund dangerous or harmful rhetoric. When we refer to platforms, we are talking about your figurative soapbox, be it a newspaper article, a TV interview, or a literal platform from which to address the masses. Deplatforming is not removing your voice. It's a refusal to amplify your voice. Granting someone a platform lends legitimacy and weight to someone's words, as well as expanding their reach and influence. It could be seen as tacit agreement. And some words are harmful. Incitement to violence, for example. Comparing certain groups of people to insects or vermin. Telling people that life-saving vaccinations are dangerous. Many people who are against deplatforming are legitimately concerned that to do so would be censorship. Free speech is very important. I agree that we should talk about differences of opinion and encourage open, fair, good faith engagement. However, many people who claim to be very pro-free speech usually draw the line somewhere, such as advocating murder. So it ends up being more of a question of where we draw that line. There is evidently a huge difference between topics that people merely disagree on and speech that causes material harm. This can range from ideas that contribute to rape culture and misogyny, to cruelty towards transgender women, to comparisons between migration and infestation. These ideas normalize violence, but are also harmful in and of themselves and are fundamentally dehumanizing. This is why laws against hate speech exist. But not everything that's harmful can be outlawed without truly interfering with free speech. But just because something isn't illegal doesn't mean it deserves to be published. I've never seen deplatforming as particularly radical or as being in conflict with free speech. Any view that is considered likely to lose subscribers and clicks, for example, is instantly and unceremoniously rejected, not platformed, by editors every day. A man claiming that the pyramids were built by aliens is not being censored just because the BBC does not offer him a primetime slot to explain his perspective. And yet people who write provably incorrect and hateful information about trans people are given newspaper columns. And when asked why, the editors will claim that they don't agree with it. Of course not. But they can't interfere with someone's free speech. As if deciding what is and is not worth publishing and whose voice is worth hearing is not their entire profession. They've decided that that view is worth discussing. It's argued that we need disparate views to have a healthy debate. I agree. However, some opinions are not valid, and facts should not be debatable. People can hold these opinions, but I don't have to treat them seriously or pay them to write about it. I'm not interested in the kind of opinion that suggests men are inherently superior to women or that gay people shouldn't exist. It's not new, it won't change anyone's mind, and it's getting boring as well as offensive. My rights should not be debatable, and I refuse to debate them. One of the biggest problems of our time is the large-scale spread of misinformation, largely due to the power of the internet. And this problem is fueled by people who profit from lies. Many right-wing reactionaries become more well-known the more controversial they are. They are published because the newspapers and news sites will get more outraged readers, and some of the readers will be converts to the cause. But what matters to the paper is how many people bought it, how many clicks it got. They watch the ad revenue increase and wonder where they can get another reactionary. Some people literally make a living by trying to be awful. YouTube is full of these people. We can in no way mandate that private organizations deplatform people. There's always going to be disagreements about what is considered unacceptable speech. But we, as viewers and consumers, can refuse to help people profit from hate. We can hold organizations and people accountable for what views they amplify, whose voices they prioritize. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they have all made huge amounts of money from the engagement of accounts that peddle hate. If you benefit from hatred, why would you do the work of suppressing it? It's only if they also take some of the blame as hosts of this violence that they will be forced to make a change. I'm a strong proponent of a good old-fashioned boycott, but the backlash and criticism against Twitter following the violence in January made its point well. But many people have speculated that misinformation campaigns on social media, as well as the constant airtime granted to Donald Trump on so-called liberal media, is what won him the election 4 years ago. And many of the harms done since cannot be reversed. But Twitter claimed for years that they couldn't ban Trump because of free speech, they said. But they can, they have, in spite of apparently free speech. They just didn't consider the previous terrible things as terrible enough, apparently, to ban him. Ultimately, I think that words can be violent. Words are a kind of action. Words can suggest and create violence, yes, but they can also be harmful in and of themselves. There can be material, psychological damage caused by discriminatory and cruel language, and some people are more easily affected than others due to trauma and societal isolation. Words can normalize physical violence and abuse against some of the most vulnerable. And if words can be violent, then by giving someone a platform, letting the racist take the microphone, giving the misogynist a column, inviting the homophobe to debate on TV, you are amplifying the reach of that violence. Furthermore, you are often even paying someone for that violence. Several reactionaries and right-wing provocateurs literally make their living by promoting cruelty. And we shrug our shoulders, hand them a megaphone and a check, and wonder why the world is becoming crueler. Finally, being given a platform is not automatic. It is not your right. You have the right to speak, but no one is required to listen. No one is required to pay you for harmful opinions. Not paying you is not censorship, and public condemnation for unpopular speech is a time-honored practice. Deplatforming is the radical idea that we shouldn't pay people for being terrible. Not every idea should be treated seriously. We can report on the realities of public opinion without paying every member of the public to share that opinion in their own words. Deplatforming is a method of decommodifying hatred. I think some of us can agree that at least some ideas are dangerous. So we have to think about where we personally draw the line and make it known when we believe that that line has been crossed. By refusing to platform hatred, we send a simple message. I won't pay you for this. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
I'd just like to thank Kate for sending that in and participating, even though she couldn't be here with us right now. Okay, so now it turns to introduce the third speaker for the opposition in tonight's debate to continue the case for the opposition, Jamie Bryson.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak at this event tonight. I know that the committee has come under tremendous pressure from a small minority of other students and indeed some non-students, but to their credit, they have refused to bow to that mob mentality. And sadly, I do think there's a real tendency, and we'll explore this in a few moments, to join in with the mob and dehumanize people and ideas, not because you as an individual have considered them and came to your own conclusion, but rather because it's simply the popular thing to do. And I think that's a very bad mindset to get into, whereby you blindly follow the latest hyper-woke fad or the self-appointed liberal standard bearers who tell you what you must like, what you must dislike, and which ideas are acceptable and which are not. This proposition, which is put forward tonight, is, in my view, little more than a bold assertion, which amounts to practically a good virtue signaling hashtag. Because whenever you drill down on it, it has absolutely no logical basis. And further to that, it is actually a blueprint for a type of fascism which operates on the basis that a group of self-appointed elites decrees which ideas and speech is acceptable. And you must, all of us, society must fall into line with that, or risk a social shaming on social media or exclusion from a social group, a metaphorical public hanging. And this proposition, to borrow a phrase from the great Justice Scalia, it is a wolf which comes dressed as a wolf. So let's take it apart quite simply. What is deplatforming? Well, deplatforming is preventing a speaker or a particular message from being provided a platform. So I don't think that can be contested. I think that is what it is. That is what it does. And now then the next crucial point: who decides which particular messages or which particular views are unacceptable? And of course, it's the proponents of deplatforming who decide which views are unacceptable. And in that respect, deplatforming is a weapon solely for the proponents of deplatforming. You're hardly going to get somebody who's opposed to deplatforming trying to deplatform somebody. And in that respect, I don't think it's hard to see where the scope is for that to go badly wrong. And then, crucially, we move on to who appoints these persons to decide who should be deplatformed. And the answer is no one. We have no system of regulation for deplatforming. No, thank you. We have no commissioner for deplatforming. All we have, and how we do that as a society, is via the law. And that in some respects is another debate altogether. So the proponents of this proposition will try, and indeed have tried, to take you on a moral tour, leading you on a winding journey which seeks to give you the warm, fuzzy feeling that supporting deplatform is to be part of a journey towards something greater, to be part of an enlightened elite who are the guardians of what is acceptable thoughts and speech. And it's a fantasy. And like all fantasies, it crumbles under the most elementary scrutiny. And that is why the fuel for so much of deplatforming comes from Twitter and other social media platforms, which isn't the actual world. It is an online world. And therefore, it's no surprise that coexists nicely with the fantasy of being part of an enlightened elite whose apparent legitimacy is derived from likes and retweets as part of a perpetual self-affirming process. And this is because Twitter provides a platform for individuals to obtain social status by virtue of being seen to signal their support for the latest hyper woke fad, or joining in with the online mob in an assault on the latest legitimate target, which for the most part is someone who some self-appointed liberal influencer has decided is somehow unacceptable.
On that point.
No, thank you. And I noticed in the lead up to this very debate that actually committee members from this organisation were publicly informed by a deplatforming activist that they should never speak to that individual again unless they took the step of resigning their positions, presumably as some form of protest against my mere speaking here tonight.
On that point.
And I think, no, thank you. And I think that actually goes to the very heart of this debate, and I want people to pause and consider that, because when you peel it back, what that actually means is that you must agree with that individual, and if you don't, then you are to be cast aside, and you're by default a terrible person. And I think that does provide a snapshot of the illiberal and bullying nature of the platform, and that is an example of the extremist logic at the heart of deplatforming. That one self-appointed person or group of persons can decide that a particular person or viewpoint is unacceptable, and that viewpoint must be deplatformed, and the person who expresses it must be vilified and dehumanized. And furthermore, everybody must join in this mob lynching, into this public hanging, lest you be seen to be complicit or somehow enabling the view of the person who has been subjectively deemed to be unacceptable. And of course, the response to this from the cheerleaders of deplatforming is that they have some societal duty to shut down unacceptable views. And that sounds all very noble and self-righteous. But what they can't explain is that why they believe that society demands this of them. Have they been appointed by some higher moral authority which gives them the right to act as judge and jury of what is and what is not acceptable? And that,
on that point.
No, thank you. And that brings me nicely back to the core structural problem with this proposition. Who decides who should be deplatformed, and from where do these self-appointed judges derive their moral authority or legitimacy? Who decides what the objective standard to be applied is, and who monitors that it's applied equally? And there is simply no coherent answer to that. Of course, proponents of deplatforming will go off in all sorts of directions and moral lectures, but bring them back to that core point. Who give you the right to decide on behalf of society what is acceptable and what isn't?
On that point.
No, thank you. Ask them 4 questions. Number 1, on whose behalf do you act? Number 2, who appointed you to act as judge and jury of which views can be heard? Number 3, what is the objective standard you apply to deplatforming? And finally, number 4, from where does this standard derive its apparent legitimacy? You won't get a logical answer because there quite simply isn't one. We decide what speech is acceptable within society, within the law, made by elected representatives. These laws, despite plainly there being difficulties with many of them, at least have some form of democratic legitimacy. They can at least lay claim to, in some way, reflecting the views of society, or at the least of the legislators society appoints. But most importantly, such laws, in theory at least, are to apply equally to all persons. There are safeguards to prevent their arbitrary deployment. But in the hyper-liberal world of deplatforming, there's no objective standard, there's no safeguards, and quite frankly, there's no legitimacy.
On that point.
And no, thank you. And all that is required to initiate this is simply to commence a Twitter pylon, and before you know it, you have managed to shut down an idea or a person you dislike without having to so much as engage your brain or develop a counter argument. And I think such pursuits have the effect of stifling ideas and of stifling free debate across society, which has been amplified by the mob culture of Twitter, where many people just simply get swept up with whatever's trending and join in with that in order to feel relevant or acceptable. And they feel they must engage in popular virtue signalling or join with the Orwellian 2 minutes hate-like assault on whoever the legitimate target is at that particular moment. And the problem with this is when it succeeds, as it often does, it affirms the mob's belief in the righteousness of their cause, and so it becomes a perpetual cycle. And that, as I alluded to earlier, is how fascism comes cloaked as liberalism. So I've outlined for you tonight the structure of the proposition is built on, and I say it's built on sand. And I've also demonstrated for you by recourse actually to an example of how the proponents of deplatforming actually turned on the very organisers of this debate, how a culture of deplatforming will eventually implode, the mob will eventually eat itself. And I say to all of those listening or watching tonight, what happens when you have an idea that the Twitter mob or the deplatformers deem unacceptable? So, of course, tonight the popular thing to do is to fall into line and support deplatforming. It will probably earn you some stripes in your social circle and in the echo chamber of Twitter, but only for now, because, of course, if you have an idea which the deplatformers do not like, then they will quite simply turn their fire on you. So if you want to genuinely stand for something, then stand for the right of every person, within the confines of the law, of course, to be able to express their views and opinions. That is the noble ideal which has survived for generations. And that is why tonight I urge you to vote against this proposition. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech, and thank you for contributing to tonight's debate. Now we turn to the fourth speaker for the proposition to continue the argument for the proposition in tonight's debate, James Hadnett. Sorry, James, you are very quiet there. Is there any chance you could be a bit louder? You're very quiet.
Hello, can you hear me?
That's a lot better.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
evening to the House, audience, and of course my lovely opposition. I'd like to start with a rebuttal of some points my opponents have made. Ms. Fox, I think it's an incredibly naive take to think that slavery and racism have been fought by debating people. I've had to debate whether or not I have worth as a human being, and I think it's disgusting to have to fight people who don't think you should exist. And throughout human history, it's been rare that direct debate has been the key to changing minds. Dr. King did not debate racists on the grounds of his worth. Harvey Milk did not debate homophobes on the ground of his worth, and Emily Davidson did not debate misogynists on the grounds of her worth. And to Ms. Fox and Mr. Ziam, it's not condescending or diminishing to the population to prevent the speech of someone spreading misinformation. Lies aren't always easy to disprove, and we live in the misinformation era. It's not like even this debate is being fact-checked as it goes along. Confirmation bias has existed for a long time. We even have a phenomenon around it in a group setting called cargo cult thinking. Expecting everyone to have the time, intelligence, and even the resources to do significant research into all views they hear is an incredibly privileged position to take. Now onto my main section debate. As much as people might wish it otherwise, university is a private business, and a business has a right to choose who it conducts itself with, and this same philosophy extends into the technological realm of social media. Before we proceed, I want to make it crystal clear, by no means at all is the proposition stupid enough to think that deplatforming is the be-all and end-all of preventing hate speech, or as Mr. Ziam claimed, countering hate speech, or of even changing a great number of minds on the subjects that people commonly get deplatformed for. Deplatforming is explicitly about reducing harm by reducing reach. It is not a silver bullet for curing ideas like racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism. On social media, this has been seen time and time again. For individuals, we have Alex Jones from InfoWars, proponent of Pizzagate, and the idea that Sandy Hook shooting was a conspiracy, was removed from most social media in 2019. And in that same year, Milo Yiannopoulos, who aside from his comments about how child molestation is tantamount to character building, ran a targeted racist ad campaign on the streaming website Twitch to defame another streamer. Since they've been deplatformed, their influence has been reduced significantly. They've seen large drops in income, viewership dropping by over 50%, Yiannopoulos declaring bankruptcy relating to this, having to move to platforms with even less viewers like Gab, Vote, and Telegram instead of using more popular platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter has been detrimental to their operations. There are so many other examples that I could use, but I don't want my entire section of the debate to just be showing how effective social media deplatforming is. And this is all without bringing up the terms of agreement that you sign when you use Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook that explicitly outline what can get you kicked off their platforms, which these people then choose to violate, in spite of the fact that they're running businesses that actively use the platforms as sources of income. God, I wish I could sign an agreement not to do something at my job, break that agreement, and then generate a fraction of the sympathy that these people seem to get. Now, to bring back my previous statement that deplatforming is about reducing harm by reducing reach of harmful ideas, if you allow someone to speak and talk on their ideas in a private setting, say contracting a political speaker for a keynote university speech, then you implicitly give their ideas at least a small amount of credence. Let's step away for a moment here and pretend that a concept like deplatforming doesn't exist. Currently, I'm sitting here having a debate with an opposition who I imagine spent at least a small amount of time on research and structuring their debate. The fact that we are having this debate means that the Literific as a society believes that both sides have reasonable credence. They each have their own merits with which to stand on. For a more extreme example, if we were having a debate on, say, the impact of climate change and what could be done to prevent it, and one side is a group of climatologists and the opposition is a group of climate change deniers, you have explicitly given the deniers' ideas credence by simply allowing them to have a seat on the discussion. Even if you spend the entire debate tearing them apart piece by bloody piece, you have given them a microphone. You have walked them on stage and said, this ideology has something that's worth discussing. And that's before you even get into the practical side of it. Why did we give the platform to someone who's arguing in bad faith and being facetious instead of, say, an alternate viewpoint on how to tackle climate change? And even with all the logic, statistics, and reasoning in the world, you can't out-debate someone who simply didn't use logic or reason to arrive at their conclusions. Ideologies like fascism, eugenics, or simply racially targeted policies aren't beaten by using facts. And most of these violent, senseless ideas have their own self-correcting mechanisms that explicitly prevent the use of reason against them, most of which you've already seen these past few years. There are liberal conspiracies attempting to silence me. This is fake news. The government is conspiring against us to suppress the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, all people are created equal, but all ideas aren't. In the picture I just painted for you, deplatforming a fascist or a racist or an anti-Semite or a eugenicist before they even get to tell their lies is necessary for the continued function of our modern society. And if debating these people, if giving them a platform and debating them actually worked, then why would these arguments still be perpetuating society nowadays? Why is fascism cropped up every 30 years since its inception when it's demonstrably a terrible form of government? Why have provably false racial stereotypes pervaded our societies for centuries? Debating the people most often deplatformed doesn't work to change their minds or even their audience's minds. And if I have to hear one more person decry I have been censored after being deplatformed, I will tear what's left of my hair out and just eat it on public TV. You have not been censored. You haven't even been blacklisted. You have not been arrested by the government or prevented from talking in any public forum. You can still write for newspapers, you still get published, you still get invited to non-university platforms, and in many cases, you don't even get deplatformed on social media because you're not stupid enough to break the rules on those platforms. No platform as a policy is simply a university deciding that from an economic and publicity standpoint, in terms of being a private business, you are far more trouble than you're worth. And this goes double for any of the organizations on the no platform ban list, 5 of the 6 having had terrorist cells associated with them, and the 6th wanting to establish a global Muslim caliphate by supposedly totally non-violent means. I can't imagine why a university wouldn't want to risk having them as representative speakers from a strictly business perspective. And even if we were to be very generous and grant speakers the same rights that, say, contract workers have, almost every individual who's been deplatformed in the UK would have seen similar trouble under the various anti-discrimination acts relating to race, gender, sexuality, and religion, and I sincerely doubt our opposition to advocate for the rolling back of those protections in favour of freedom of consequence. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition isn't advocating for silencing people on the left or on the right. People who have interesting policies on immigration or quite unfortunate stances on the trans community, or even hot takes on Islam and its influence in the world. We're banning people because they're incapable of having anything close to these stances and because they're incapable of rationally discussing them in a debate or private forum without talking about restricting individuals' rights. We're talking about people who incite calls to violence against the Israeli populace. We're talking about people who say that trans-identifying individuals should be sectioned and sterilized, and that's from individuals who haven't been put on the no-fly list. In conclusion, as I said earlier, all ideas are not created equally. If there truly is such a thing as the free marketplace of ideas, then deplatforming is simply the will of the marketplace letting itself become known. A man doesn't build an inferior product and malign the consumer for people buying into his competitors' products. And in the same way, it's not the liberal media conspiring against you. It's not snowflakes seeking to silence you. Your idea is either too dangerous or simply just unpopular, and crying out that you're being oppressed by a private institution instead of working to fix the flaws in your ideology is just pathetic. I would hate to see a world that my opposition is campaigning for, one where the speaker is held to no consequence and bends private institutions to their will to advertise whatever extremist ideology pops between the two random brain cells clashing together in their heads. That sounds a lot more like oppression to me. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I urge for you to vote proposition.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James, for your speech there and your contribution in tonight's debate. Now we turn to the fourth opposition speaker to continue the case for the opposition in tonight's debate, Ella Whelan.
Thank you very much for having me tonight, and we'll see what the two brain cells in my head can come up with over the next 10 minutes. There is nothing new about the idea of no platforming. In fact, no platforming as a policy on campus itself has been around for decades. It was instituted first by the NUS back in the 70s, and Tom Slater from Spiked, my colleagues, has written a lot about this. And it was in its origin of quite relatively specific. It was quite specifically about fascists, which in the 70s was, you know, quite a much more of a very real threat in politics than it is today. But it also, as the years went on, began to include things like, no, thank you, things like Zionist societies or Jewish societies. And indeed, in 1977, the Jewish Society itself was told that it couldn't hold an Israel week, it couldn't have any speakers from Israel. And in 1986, the SWP's Lindsay German wrote about the fact that she was worried about this expansion, SWP being one of the political groups that was central to the NUS's campaign for no platform. So they realized in years later in 86 that actually that this expansion of no platform to include more and more speakers, more and more groups, more and more types of speech in its ban was a problem at South Bank, what used to be South Bank Poly. Groups of black students were no platformed for listening to tapes of Louis Farrakhan. In 2001, fast forward to then, Eminem was banned at Sheffield University because of his offensive lyrics. And in the last 10 years, we've had no platform policies on campus instituted to, in one way or another, stop speeches from Julie Bindel, a serious feminist, from third-rate comedians like Dapper Laughs, from political activists like Peter Tatchell, from politicians like Amber Rudd. All of these people have either been no platformed or banned or snubbed or called too dangerous to speak in one way or another. And of course, it doesn't, as many of the speakers who have gone before me have mentioned, the motion tonight doesn't just necessarily pertain to no platform on campus. In fact, I'd argue that the idea of no platforming, though it might have begun as an NUS policy in the 1970s, has expanded to become basically tantamount to censorship, to what we now call, many people call cancel culture in wider society. And in the last number of years, though banning people has happened throughout the decades, throughout the centuries, there's been an acceleration of censorship, call it cancel culture, call it no platforming, call it whatever you like. For example, Nick Buckley, who was the leader of a charity in Manchester, was dismissed by the charity for posting no thank you post about Black Lives Matter, then reinstated despite the fact that his post was not racist in any way, shape or form. It merely was criticising Black Lives Matter. Julian Phillips, who was a children's author, was dropped by her publisher for tweeting in support of J.K. Rowling, and some people have mentioned the discussion about trans issues and the tensions of that political debate. And Rebecca Long-Bailey, Labour MP, was sacked by Keir Starmer, caused huge amounts of controversy because she retweeted an article by Maxine Peake, the actress and Labour activist, who within the article had I think you could probably call it a less than true statement about Israeli soldiers and their practices. So the issue of censorship and cancel culture and no platforming and crackdowns on free speech might have begun as a perhaps in some ways laudable desire to combat very serious political threats, be it fascist or otherwise, but has expanded pretty much since the word go to now encompass all political aspects, from left or right, extreme or banal. I mean, just as a point of sort of sad and rather bitter irony, the SWP are now learning the lesson of the history of their position on free speech. have been taken off of Facebook alongside Donald Trump for being a extreme political party. I mean, that is the extent to the attacks on free speech today. Not even has attacks on censorship relegated to the 20th or the 21st century. This book by Mick Hume, Trigger Warnings, got a fantastic history of free speech in it. And he points to John Ball, who was a radical priest in 1381, who was excommunicated by the church for preaching to the people in the English vernacular. And he had this phrase that has been quoted throughout the years, throughout the centuries. John Ball posed the question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And what he was really saying was getting to the heart of the question of free speech, which is that who is allowed to decide what is said, who is allowed to decide what is and isn't offensive. Now, when John Ball was talking, no, thank you. When John Ball was risking his free speech, he really was risking something, because he was killed. His head was stuck on a pike outside London Bridge as a warning to anybody else tempted to speak out against, and they quote from that time, the great lords of the realm. The great lords of the realm, we might not be talking about kings or queens or despotic monarchs or totalitarian regimes. But it's interesting that in such a benign, such a safe, such a regulated space as a university campus, just as a side note, I think it's very telling that the proposition have continued to most people actually, most of the speakers have continued to talk about university as if it was a place where students come and access a service in this kind of customer and service provider relationship, which, you know, I think a university is one of the reasons why university experience has deteriorated. I think it is supposed to be a place for free ideas. It's supposed to be a challenging public open space, not a private company that gets to institute policies on the people paying for a service. But in that idea of the great lords of the realm, the idea that student union presidents who are, I can tell you from, I remember my days at Sussex, are not mass elected, do not hold the support of the mass of the student body, in fact, are not even independent after the 2010 Charities Act, are answerable to university administrations. I would be very suspicious of placing my trust in allowing those people, whether it be communications officers, student unions presidents, or in fact just loudmouths on campus, trusting them with the decision of who I can and can't invite as a speaker. Because I think this is one of the key points that I think have been missed, and Claire picked up on this, is that the idea, someone towards the beginning floated this idea that what no platforming really just is about not passing the mic. It's just about, or I think it was Kate said, is not paying someone to put forward an opinion. And it's fundamentally missing the point of what no platform is. No platform is a preemptive measure. It's something that says, it's not just, as Claire says, something that actually after the effect cancels people. It's a preemptive measure. It gives a list saying, these are the people you are not allowed to invite. And in fact, the reality is on many student campuses today, there are policies in place which say you have to pre-vet speakers. You have to, as many people who have been student organisers on here will know, you have to submit speakers far in advance. And a lot of the time you get refused to allow permission for those speakers to be able to come to campus. So this is a preemptive measure, which means that it is essentially asking people to self-censor. So it's not about passing the mic, it's about saying you're not allowed to have any access to any resources as a student organizer wanting to put a debate on campus, unless the speaker that you're inviting is vetted on the basis of the subjective political desires of the people in charge. I think that's fundamentally wrong. It's undemocratic, and it's quite clear an exercise in censorship. And I also want to challenge this idea that it's simply about a small policy, that cancel culture or no platforming, or whatever you want to call it, is just simply a kind of a small aspect. And what's really the problem? I remember when I was working at Spiked, and when we were running the Free Speech University rankings, we would often be laughed at by NUS members and other people who disagreed with the idea that there was a free speech problem, as creating a storm in the teacup, as really making a big song and a dance about nothing. But actually, if we look at the wider, in wider culture and wider society and wider discussions about politics, the now knee-jerk reaction for you can't say that, the growth of this really quite infantile idea that words harm, that words are as bad as actions, that students need to be protected as adults in a free and supposedly free and open society proves that when we were making a fuss about free speech 5 or 10 years ago, we actually, even ourselves, didn't know the scale of where this was going to go. The difference today, I think, is that we often are living in bad faith. I think that a lot of the time, rather than in the 70s when the NUS and others said, yeah, we're banning these people and there's no space for them and we are not going to give ground. Now there's a kind of desire to hide behind what really is censorship and say it's not really about censorship, it's about lifting up the voices of minorities, or it's about making campus a safe space, when really no one wants to admit that what they're doing is being cowardly in the face of adverse opinions, and actually being cowardly about, as Claire pointed out, their own ability to win the argument. As has been mentioned previously, and I'll sort of end on this point, there has been fuss about one of the speakers here coming to join in the debate, and there often is. And I think when you get people who are defending free speech, we often tend to be those who are willing to take rather extreme positions, because you have to have guts to be able to talk about free speech and defend free speech. So I want to just read a short quote from one of my political heroes, James Connolly, who, there's two quotes I want to read to you. The first one was he was talking to his daughter in 1915 after he had been berated by a priest for supporting striking dockers in Dublin at the time, and he was kind of going off on a rant to his daughter Nora, and he said to her, "We mean to be free, and in every enemy of tyranny we recognise a brother. Wherever be his birthplace, in every enemy of freedom we also recognise our enemy. Nor we demand free speech for ourselves. We must grant it to others, even though their opinions are different from ours." And I'll finish on this, a second quote from the Workers' Republic, which is a paper he organised and wrote for in 1915. He said this, which I think is just, I mean, it was written in 1915, it's relevant today. "The liberty of the public meeting is also rapidly becoming a thing of the past in Ireland, as far as it may be used for the criticism of the activities of the government or its functionaries." And this is an important bit. "And yet it is this very right of a subject to criticise the governing bodies, be they the government at the time or student union bodies, which is the very essence of a freedom in a constitutionally governed country. Without the freedom of the press and the right of public meeting, there is no citizenship. There are only the relations of subject and rulers, of slaves and slave drivers. The question of whether the press was not right or wrong in its criticisms, or whether the public meeting does or does not advocate wise measures or use wise language, has no bearing upon the matter." I think if we try and encapsulate and remember the bravery of someone like James Connolly and the bravery of the people that are standing for free speech today, and try and emulate that bravery and have the courage of our convictions, we'll realise that no platform is actually a block on any kind of progressive politics. And if you really want to make change in society, as some of my previous speakers have said, you have to grab the bull by the horns and support free speech.
Thank you for your speech and your contribution in tonight's debate. Now I turn to the fifth and final speaker for the proposition in tonight's debate to conclude the argument for the proposition, Ciara Swail.
So, the Holocaust didn't happen. Hitler was great and Trump won the election. All views that, according to the opposition, Queens should be forced to give a platform to. You may have accused me of using extreme examples, and by that you would be right. But it is in the extremes that the opposition argument falls apart. Do not get me wrong. I'm not for 1 minute insinuating that the opposition supports these arguments or finds them valid in any way. But what I'm saying is that the debate is this House would support no platforming. So the opposition must justify that we should absolutely never no platform someone. We can't just go, right, okay, I don't support no platforming, except when this is the case. No, you have to support it or not to support it. And because, believe it or not, there are many organisations that are not allowed to have a platform in the UK, namely terrorist organisations, including other ones that would all love to have our head on a pike. This is for many reasons. It limits the ability of the organisation to radicalise people. It limits their ability to recruit, among other things. And I don't think anyone would support people like them coming to speak at Queen's because A, it's illegal, and B, who in their right mind would want to give these not jobs a platform? It's an extreme example, and I'm aware of that, but because of this motion, the opposition must justify this. I don't believe they have. Now, first of all, a bit of rebuttal. Now, we heard from Jamie Bryson a big speech about who gets to decide who gets to no platform people. And I will respond to this in context of the university. A student-elected body that is democratically elected to lead the students. Now, Ella then went on to say, oh, but maybe these people don't represent my views. They can't choose for me. Well, in that logic, we shouldn't support our government because not everyone votes in elections. And also, we've heard this presupposition. We've been accused on our side of basically saying that everyone is too stupid to tell the difference. But I would argue that their presupposition is equally wrong because it presumes that every single person is able to distinguish between racist ideology and stuff that is actually factually accurate. Because words do have power. Words used by Donald Trump led to a woman's death and the insurrection against the Capitol. So to argue that this somehow doesn't have any impact on people, I think is wrong. Another argument has been made by the opposition tonight that universities should be the marketplace of ideas, where students should be challenged on their views based with different viewpoints and be better educated as a result, which is an idea I rather agree with. I am a member of a debating society after all. What I don't agree with is this idea that awful, horrendous viewpoints are requirements to achieve this. In order to demonstrate my point, I shall now all tell you the story of my first debate at this society that I attended, which was this House would support a united Ireland, probably one of the most contentious debates you could have in Northern Ireland. And I said to myself before it, oh God, this is going to be a mess. There's going to be sectarian arguments. There's going to be people there's going to be people making disingenuous arguments, and it's going to be an absolute mess. And I walked out of that debate being very surprised that I did not see any of that. I did not have to listen to a sectarian comment to be informed around an issue. I did not need the leaders of the new IRA that killed Lyra Mickey to come in and tell me about the history of British occupation. I did not need the people who put Martin McGuinness on put a picture of Martin McGuinness on a bonfire in order to tell me the issues about unionist identity being lost in United Ireland. And that's my point here. You can have contentious debates without having outright horrendous, horrific views. I have been part of this debating society for 4 years, and I have never once heard a racist comment. I have never once heard a sexist comment, and that's because there are rules we have in place to make sure that people feel welcome in this society. No, thank you. We have had many contentious issues. We've debated on abortion. We've debated on sex work. We've debated on everything. So I have been challenged on my views. I've listened to many people that I do not agree with. I have argued on sides that I do not agree with. And it hasn't been a requirement to have these awful, horrendous views being broadcast to everyone that will listen to it. Because I don't think it's worth giving a platform to someone who genuinely believes that the Holocaust didn't happen, because you're wasting that platform on someone who can actually debate about the topic at hand and not about nonsense that next to no one believes. And now the final argument that I'm going to counter,
on that point,
no thank you, which has been made by the opposition tonight, is the notion that deplatforming removes the individual's right to free speech, and that somehow if we let minority organisations have the right to not give their platform to anyone who wants it, then that will lead us to some Orwellian dystopia where no one is allowed to say anything anymore and that the right will be silenced. That a snowflake like me should defend the right to the freedom of speech of even these heinous individuals, because someday it could be me that could be deplatformed. Now, to counter this argument, I'm going to basically tell a fact. Now, many guest speakers on the opposition side of the argument have told us about being deplatformed before. However, I know that all of the speakers on tonight's opposition are published authors. I also know that they have newspaper columns. The Literific themselves have chosen to give them a platform tonight. They have been able to express their freedom of speech at multiple occasions. Jamie Bryson is the editor of a monthly newsletter. Ella has basically created this association where you can debate controversial ideas, and no one has silenced them. They are still able to say their viewpoints. It's just not everyone has the obligation to hear it, because you cannot force me to read their articles. You cannot force me to buy their books, and you cannot force me to give a platform to anyone who wants it.
On that point?
No, thank you. Because there is a difference between the freedom of expression and the freedom to be heard. And they're very different things. I can say whatever I want. That is the freedom of expression. However, the freedom of being heard basically would make people have to listen to me, which is basically what the opposition are kind of claiming, because they are saying that if a university initially invites someone to speak and then changes their mind and doesn't want them to speak, then that university should be forced to still have them on, even though they don't want them on anymore. So, hence why I am on the proposition side tonight, because I cannot and will not support a side that basically means that people with horrendous views that should never be given the platform, and those who break the establishment's rules, as was the case with Trump, should be given a platform, because it would force businesses to give platforms to and hence be associated with these individuals when they don't want to be. I have also been witness to and participant in many debates that were informative, and that taught me about different worldviews. And I didn't have to listen to these horrendous views. These horrendous views are not a requirement to a great debate, as was suggested by the first member of the proposition. And third and finally, if someone has been deplatformed, they are still able to express their freedom of speech through organizations that will gladly have them, like the Literific tonight. So I urge you all to vote for the proposition tonight, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Keir, for that speech and your contribution in tonight's debate. Now we turn to the final speaker of the night, the fifth speaker for the opposition to conclude the opposition's argument in tonight's debate, Keir Crozier.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I feel extremely privileged to be able to close this, our second great debate of the term. This is an issue which is to us, as members of a debating society, perhaps more pertinent than any other we have debated, for it affects our very ability to function, to carry out the purpose which the Literific serves. For no platforming is an attempt to stifle debate by the crudest means, an attempt to win the argument without having it in the first place, an attempt to erase the Enlightenment values of challenging prevailing orthodoxies, speaking truth to power, instead replacing them with a dull, unquestioning submission. We have seen people attempt to use this tactic here recently. It's been mentioned already. We saw it in the first great debate when the online mob tried to argue that we simply shouldn't hold the debate, or that at least Anne Widdecombe shouldn't be invited. We saw it again last week when similarly there were those who expressed the opinion my colleague on the opposition tonight, Mr. Jamie Bryson, should be no platformed. My response to such suggestions is this. If you simply do not like Miss Whitcomb or Mr. Bryson, whilst you're perfectly entitled to hold that opinion, it is nevertheless nothing more than ad hominem, and it does not serve as sufficient justification to preclude said individuals from speaking to our society. If, on the other hand, your hostility is not based on any personal animosity, but rather fear of what an individual might say, then I will quote you Voltaire, who said, "I despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
On that point,
Yes, go ahead.
first of all, thank you for being the only member of the opposition brave enough to take a POI. Secondly, Voltaire never made that quote. And thirdly, on your point of these people deplatforming speakers of the Literific, those people do not have the power to deplatform anybody. We, as the Literific Council, had that power, and we did not deplatform them. We chose to use our resources to let them speak, and we had every right not to do that.
Right, well, I'll address all 3 points you've made there. Firstly, thank you. I perfectly happy to take a POI. I probably won't have time to take any more, but hey, you can always chance your arm. The second one, I think Voltaire did say it. If he didn't say it, it's still true. And finally, sorry, Matt, so what's your last point again? Okay, I'll come on to I'm sure someone's teaching the speech. But no, yes, as the Literific, not the platforming the people, yeah. Which is quite right, but if anything, that's more case for our side of the argument. You took the right decision. I admire you for taking that. The people who wanted you to deplatform them, the ones who had the wrong viewpoint. So I don't really see how the fact that these people weren't deplatformed somehow makes deplatforming more right. And I would say, why should we fear what any speaker at our university has to say? Mr. Sullivan, you yourself, you talked about how it's only fascists and extremists who get deplatformed under the National Union of Student Guidelines. But this isn't strictly true. I mean, Jordan Peterson has been no platformed at Cambridge University simply because he was pictured with a person who happened to be wearing a t-shirt with an offensive slogan on it. Jacob Rees-Mogg was attacked at Oxford University. And again, this is a member of Parliament of the Conservative Party, but yet he was there was an attempt by students to deplatform him. So it's not only fascist, and all the attention has come on the far right, but why not communist when communism has killed over 100 million people? There's also the point that has been repeatedly made by the proposition about that these are private companies. But when you have monopolies like Facebook and Twitter...
On that point.
No, thank you. I've already taken one, maybe later. When you have these companies who have monopolies like Facebook, like Twitter, in effect, they're more like phone companies than they are publishers. And it'd be more like in the days of a nationalised BT simply saying, well, you're, let's say, transphobic or racist, things which maybe they're not laudable characteristics, but say we're going to cut off your telephone connection as a result. So I think when these people have this market share, that they have a responsibility not to abuse it. Similarly, as to universities, the idea that universities are private corporations, well, every university gets £22,000 a year from the government and government funding. They're publicly funded bodies, and therefore they have a right to uphold academic standards rather than simply pandering to the lowest common denominator. I'll address some points made by the second speaker on the proposition as well, Ms. Zaidi. She talks about how Nigel Farage gets a platform and complains that nobody on the far left gets a platform. And yet we have people like Bonnie Greer, Nish Kumar, Nigel Farage, no being realistic, Nish Kumar is a comedian, Owen Jones, Ash Sarkar, who went on TV wearing a t-shirt with the word Marx emblazoned on it, who proudly says, I am literally a communist. And so I don't see where she gets this idea that somehow the media does not provide a platform equal, or if not greater, on the left than it does on the right. She also talked about the likes of Steve Bannon normalizing Trumpist views. But Donald Trump won a US presidential election. His defeat in the second US election was the most votes ever won by a defeated candidate. The idea that somehow these views are being normalized, that is the grossest example of bolting the door or closing the door when the horse is bolted. These views were normalized long before Steve Bannon ever went on television. She also raised the issue about how freedom of speech somehow conflicts with people's feelings of safety or freedom of religion. But I simply don't, I think this is a straw man. I just don't see how this affects us at all.
On that point?
No, thank you. Central to the case against no platforming is John Stuart Mill's idea of the free market of ideas. Just like a free market of goods, differing ideas compete against each other, and the good ones thrive and prosper, whilst the bad ones are shown up for what they are and rejected in a kind of intellectual Darwinism. Without competition, we end up with stagnation, as orthodoxies are not challenged, be they right or wrong. When subjected to scrutiny, a bad idea will be shown up for what it is, but this cannot happen when these ideas and those who advance them are simply silenced. On the contrary, they gain a certain mystique. Humans are naturally curious. They will seek out these ideas which are forbidden, and they will find them in the dark corners of the internet or extremist groups and communities where, unlike somewhere like Literific, they will not be properly challenged. The best challenge to a bad speech, be it hate speech or simply misinformation, is not to excommunicate those who preach it, but to provide the counter evidence. If we are confident that we are on the side which is good, which is morally and factually correct, then we have nothing to fear from open debate because we will be vindicated. The fear, of course, is for those on the proposition that if those who would spread extremist or misleading ideas are given a platform, then people will fall victim to them.
On that point.
No, thank you. But this is much more likely to happen if they are driven underground, where they flourish in a feedback loop of groupthink, than they are when challenged in the open. Of course, the issue of no platforming is not merely limited to hate speech, or indeed even speech which may be considered offensive. We have also seen people no platform based on the accusation that they are peddling misinformation. This has come to the fore in particular in the last year, where people have come under fire, many of them distinguished scientists and even Nobel Prize winners for chemistry, for their criticism of the handling of the coronavirus pandemic. For example, YouTube temporarily suspended Talk Radio's channel because they provided a platform to lockdown skeptics, whilst Google blocked research results for the Great Barrington Declaration, which advocated for a targeted protection approach as opposed to universal lockdown. The Guardian journalist Owen Jones even criticised the media for giving the eminent oncologist, Professor Carol Sikora, a platform. What was Sikora's crime? Supposedly he was guilty of being too optimistic. To call Professor Sikora a lockdown skeptic is to stretch the term to breaking point. He has continually encouraged people to abide by restrictions, whilst encouraging people to get their cancer symptoms checked and generally holding a glass half full approach. But for Owen Jones, even this is too much. He should be no platformed. But perhaps Mr. Jones ought to cast his mind back. Just over a year ago, the World Health Organization proclaimed that COVID-19 was not transmissible from human to human. If one had claimed that it was, one would have been guilty of misinformation. Later, during the peak of the first wave, both the World Health Organization and their own government scientists claimed that masks were ineffective and should not be worn. Had one disagreed and encouraged people to wear a mask, one would again have been guilty of misinformation. Yet when one looks at how quickly the science, to use that detestable but also popular trump card, changed, the idea that to disagree with the prevailing orthodoxy is somehow dangerous becomes frankly laughable. This is nothing new. In the 1960s, we used to give thalidomide to pregnant women to cure morning sickness, until we discovered it caused children to be born with missing limbs. As Umar mentioned, we used to think the sun revolved around the earth. The story of science is a story of thinking things that were true and then discovering they weren't. And the only way to make these discoveries is allowing people to ask the questions. In 1633, Galileo was imprisoned for claiming the earth went around the sun. The Enlightenment was supposed to have put this kind of behavior firmly in the past. And yet tonight, we have a proposition who want to bring it back. And on this proposition, I do notice that all their arguments come from what could broadly be described as a left liberal basis. Indeed, the examples they have given are on the right, such as Donald Trump and right-wing ideas that ought to be deplatformed. But the liberal left does not have a monopoly on no platforming. We can look at Nazi Germany with its burning of books and banning of opposition. We can look at China's censorship of the internet. We can look at the blasphemy laws which remain in Islamic theocracies in the Middle East. The suppression of dissent has long been and will continue to be the favoured tool of tyrants of all stripe. The proposition, I would suggest, is guilty of wishful thinking, and that they assume it will be people like them who think the way they think, who will hold the power to decide who and who will not have a platform. The only way to ensure reasoned and fair debate is to hear all ideas, challenge them, and trust in the intelligence of the people to determine what is right. And trust is ultimately what tonight's debate boils down to. The proposition does not believe that you have the intelligence to be allowed to tell right from wrong, fact from fiction, to make up your own minds. We do. The motto of our venerable and veritable society is Sapere Aude, which translates into dare to know, words which Kant saw as the guiding principle of the Enlightenment. But to know, first we must dare to ask, and only one side on tonight's debate wants to silence the voice of those who would do so. And therefore it is clear that tonight you must vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Keir, for your speech and contribution in tonight's debate. So now, before we launch the Twitter poll and have the vote at the end of the debate, there is time for a few questions. During the debate tonight, you've been commenting on the page, or you've been sending messages into council members and the Literific page itself. We have received questions directed to each individual speaker and also questions directed to the proposition and opposition respectively, but we'll get through some questions now. So the first question that I received in tonight's debate was from Shane, who asks Jamie Bryson, how easily would you platform someone you fundamentally agree with, for example, the head of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou McDonald?
Well, I mean, in the first point, Sinn Féin are, of course, a party of government, so I think it's somehow absurd that an unelected individual and commentator would be required to platform Sinn Féin. I have no issue with Sinn Féin or Mary Lou McDonald having a platform. And in fact, I spoke at a university in England about 2 years ago with a Sinn Féin MLA, and we were actually on the same side of the debate. So I'm really not sure of what the proposition is there behind that. But I have no issue with Sinn Féin having the views and debating them and arguing with them. And indeed, I appear on the media with Irish nationalists who are members of Sinn Féin all the time, and I absolutely do not want to deplatform them. In fact, I welcome the debate and I welcome the discussion with them to, in my view, challenge their views and opinions. And actually, you know, some of my closest friends in the media are actually Irish nationalists who I spend most of my time fighting and arguing with. So the notion that I would try and somehow deplatform or silence anybody with a different view is preposterous, as it is some kind of baseless proposition. Thank you for that answer. The next question is directed to Afroze. The question is from James, and James asks, at which point is the line drawn between which speech is acceptable and which speech isn't?
Thank you, James, for your question. I think what I really the point that I really want to make for the proposition today is that my humanity is not up for debate. And anyone who is going to come on stage and try and, you know, debate whether or not Muslims deserve to be in this country, or whether or not refugees deserve to be in this country, or whether or not trans people are really trans, or whether or not women should, you know, be, basically, my right to exist is not up for debate. It is not a valid point of view that deserves airtime. And that is the bottom line. I also just want to address that the opposition, the way that the arguments that they've made is sort of like in some kind of utopia where everybody has the same, you know, equal rights, everything is equal, there's no power imbalance, there are no, like, you know, there's no structural oppression in place, and everyone is kind of, you know, equally has access to freedom of speech and to the right to, you know, live their lives however they want, when that is fundamentally not the case. We are living in a fundamentally unequal society, and what we need to take into account is those power imbalances when we are giving people a platform. I just want to finally finish off on Mr. Crozier's point that the idea that Trump won an election and so his views should be given a platform to be normalized in the UK because he won an election in the US is absurd, right? Firstly. Secondly, Owen Jones is really not far left. And thirdly, even if he was, you really cannot compare the amount of prime time you know, exposure that far-right views have been given in the mainstream media in this country over the last, say, 3-4 years to what's been given, you know, on the equivalent side to the left. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. This question is now to Claire Fox. The question is from Caitlin, and Caitlin asks, quite simply, at what age should people be exposed to views, and should there kind of be minorities that are shielded away from from abhorrent views such as children, etc., or young people in high schools?
Well, young people are not generally considered to be minority, but it is true that children are not adults. It's when adults get treated as children that I worry. As it happens, I was involved in setting up a school's debating competition that now runs as Debating Matters for sixth formers, in which we try and give young teenagers the opportunity to take ideas seriously and argue about them and take on these issues precisely so that when they enter into the adult world, they will have some experience of understanding there's always two sides to an argument. I think that's very important. But of course, you know, if you're going to say, why don't we have all views thrown at 10-year-olds, that would be ridiculous, because we don't treat 10-year-olds as adults. They are protected. But it really is important that minorities are not children. And that was that kind of flip there, you know, should we protect minorities? That's the problem. Is I fear a paternalism that says that particular minority groups need to be looked after, protected. And even this thing about the power imbalance, you know, that the people in power should be doing special favors for minorities. I can't imagine anything more condescending, to be frank with you. And I suppose whilst I have a moment, just if I could just respond to one thing, you know, this idea of far right and far left. I mean, first of all, I don't know who the far right. The far right are everywhere, apparently, in every media station. I'm not entirely convinced by that proposition. Well, one thing I would say is I was recently involved in a debate on anti-Semitism. And I do know that one of the speakers earlier said that Jeremy Corbyn didn't get as much airtime as I think it was Nigel Farage. Why isn't he on the TV all the time? I mean, he was the leader of the Labour Party. He did have a fair amount of time in the media at that stage. The fact that he screwed over the working class, made a mess of running the Labour Party, is really his fault and the Labour Party's fault, nobody else's. But on the anti-Semitism point, he's been done as an anti-Semite, and you will have all the time arguments about whether he is, in fact, expressing anti-Semitic views, and he should therefore be no platform. Some people would say that. I disagree. I think there's a serious problem of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, but I think that argument needs to be had out. And so I would say there should be equally time given to contentious issues for adults on all sides. And the only way that you do something about power imbalances is by allowing those arguments to be thrashed out and the best argument win, not banning people or demonizing them with labels of extremists or far right or far left or anything else. Listen to the argument, not the labels. And that's one thing we could teach children to grow up with, which is never take any notice of the label, listen to the argument that you're hearing, do your own research and take your own ideas seriously enough to never just believe what you're told. And that's why I'm a free speech activist.
Thank you. Ella, you mentioned in your speech the student unions on campus and their involvement with the no platforming movement. One question is whether students do have the right to decide who they want to hear from and who they don't, and whether that's a right that they're, as a collective, are reserved to.
Well, absolutely, in principle. I mean, it's a technical, boring point, but it's an important one in the context of the debate, which is that students' unions are not students' unions anymore. They haven't been since 2010. And it's something that I campaigned around, we campaigned around when we were at university. You know, the fact that because of the nature of the way student unions are now run, I think it's that they're officially under kind of charitable status, that they have to answer to a board of university administrative staff. And so, you know, the quintessential idea of how a union works and is solely answerable to its members is not how students' unions work anymore. And add into that the difficult, tricky issue, which is that anyone knows, I mean, it's a long time since I've been in university, making myself sound old now, but you know, anyone knows that the level of involvement in student politics on the basis of the student body as a whole is very minimal. I mean, I remember when we were doing it at the height of the kind of rows over fees, it was always pretty difficult to get quorum at a meeting. So, you know, the kind of the benefits of this, the positives that I cling to is that the majority of students on a campus will get on and do what they want in their lives as students, regardless of the hectoring of some of the, you know, rather rather extreme, insulting and patronizing views we've had from the proposition tonight. They get on and do what they want. But the question is, the sort of rather irritating portrayal of what we've been saying by the other side. It's not name calling. We've got no problem with that. We're fine with that. But it's this idea that the debate around no platform is simply about the question of whether you should force a student body to hear a certain view, or whether we should have to listen to certain points of view, whether we should have to give people a mic, whether we should have to give people a platform. I mean, it's really simple. If you don't want to host someone on a debate, don't host the debate. If you don't want to listen to someone on a debate, don't go to it. But if you do want to, it's a question of choice. You should be, if we support choice, support freedom, this is central, the pro-choice movement has been brought up. If you support the idea of choice and freedom, then you hold up that ability for people to make choices. I also just want to remind everyone that when we're talking about students' unions and students on campuses today, it is incredibly rare that anyone gets any kind of level of the extreme views that we have been talking about, racist or fascist or elsewhere. When I was organising around the Free Speech University rankings at Spite back in 2014 or 2015, we came across a guy at UCL who was not right-wing, who decided that he was going to set up a UKIP society just on the basis of the fact that he was so angry that no one was going to allow this point of view to be heard. He was not a UKIP supporter, but he said, there's such an absence of this sort of debate that I'm just going to do it to see what happens. So, the idea that students' unions are bobbling with a populace of students that are just on the brink of, turning to kind of Nick Griffin disciples is ridiculous. But even if they were, and this is the central point, even if they were, the question is, are you willing to take up the challenge of your own political convictions? From the civil rights movement to the movements for women's liberation, movements for sexual liberation today, whether you be on the side of, trans debate, whether you be on the side of women's rights debate, whatever position you are in and arguing for progress in society, you're not going to be gifted societal change. The powers that be are not going to grant you what you want. You're going to have to argue for it, and you're going to have to fight for it. And so the level of cowardice at the heart of no platforming is denying the fact that any movement in society that made progress had to fight tooth and nail for it. And if you can't even face a debate on one of the safest places in society on a university campus, then Jesus, what's wrong with you?
Thank you. This question now is directed to Matthew Sullivan. You talked a lot about the individual's right to platform and the individual's right to choose who they know platform, but who ultimately has the right to choose who to platform?
Well, I think I made that really clear in my speech. The people who choose whether to platform or deplatform an individual is the person who owns the platform. If I own a microphone, I have the right to not give you that microphone. If I own a stage, I have the right to not give you access to that stage. If I have a democratic mandate from the student body to enforce policy, then I have the right to enforce a no platforming policy and not invite certain speakers. If I am part of a students' union leadership council and I put a referendum to the students, should we invite or should we create a no platforming policy, and the students vote yes, then I now have a mandate to enforce that no platforming policy. So I think that the answer to that question is extremely simple, and it is the person who has the right to platform or deplatform you is the person who owns the platform. And I think that's trivially obvious to anyone who knows about what the right to freedom of expression means, or what the right to freedom from compulsion to speech means.
Thank you. This question now is to James Hadnett. It's from Mark. Mark says, is it not better to hold these people in the light of day so they can be exposed for their views rather than simply drive them on the ground?
I did talk quite a bit about this in my speech specifically. The problem with that is that if you give someone a platform to spread ideologies that are commonly prosecuted under hate speech laws, then even if sorry, the problem with that is that you're still giving them an audience. And like I said before, logic is not any specific cure to prove that you're right. And even if you are correct, it's just not a guarantee that you'll convince them correctly.
Well, I'd just like to bring Umar into this conversation here, because Umar, you said you referenced MLK in your speech and said that, you know, he would have been no platformed for his views going against the grain of society there. So is there any basis for people to challenge racists, or is it pointless?
Well, of course, there's a basis for people to challenge racists. I think it's been. I think the fact that the civil rights movement has, for a large part, prevailed in the United States, and attitudes regarding race and ethnicity have vastly changed over the past 70 odd years, proves that having this debate and platforming people who would challenge the prevailing orthodoxy has been the main mode of progress.
Thank you. And the final question that I've got, and this is open to anyone to comment to, is with Twitter's recent banning of Donald Trump from the site, even though it is a private platform, it could be argued that new social media sites have become the public town squares of kind of yesteryear. So is this an issue we should be concerned about, or do they kind of retain their private ability as a corporation to choose who they platform and who they don't platform? If anyone would like to come in on that. Yep, Claire.
I think it's interesting that the people who've been most enthusiastic about Twitter and Facebook banning Donald Trump are the people who talk about power imbalances, because if ever we've seen a power imbalance, it's when big tech at Silicon Valley get to decide who and what the rest of us follow or see on social media. I mean, these are the power brokers, and they now decide what it is that is scientifically literate, what is accurate, what is misinformation, who it is that we should hear or not. Technically, it's entirely feasible that they shouldn't do that, I agree. I was more worried about what happened with Parler, and before everybody thinks that I was keen to be on Parler, I can't stand Parler because I don't like echo chambers, another reason I'm a free speech activist. But nonetheless, Parler, you know, for those people who say, well, you get kicked off one platform, you know, that's all right, go to another one. Or why don't you all pile onto Parler then? And people did try and pile onto Parler, only to discover that all of the other big tech companies removed their right to operate as a platform. And the next minute you saw the removal of them from app stores, YouTube and Apple and so on. So I think that what's important to understand is that this is a broad trend. I mean, some people have tried to argue this as though it's just a student matter, and I was looking at the student issue as well. But I think that it's important to understand there is a censorious climate at the moment that means that the people with power do get to decide. The other thing about people in power is that certain attitudes prevail that are now popular. What I'm suggesting is that Anne Widdecombe, when we talk about the previous debate that you had, is not a woman of power anymore. Her views are considered to be old-fashioned and outmoded. And the people who have power are likely to have more progressive, right-on, some people say woke, whatever it is, views. I'm suggesting that would be wrong to say that only powerful, dominant views are heard, but we should hear all views, that we should be prepared to listen to a variety of views and recognize that some views, even if they're unpopular and only represent a minority, are worth hearing. So I think when we talk about power relations, we should remember that the people who've got the power are doing the censoring, and the views which are now most powerfully used to silence others are the fashionable, popular views, as Jamie mentioned earlier. And the unpopular, dissident views are the ones that are being silenced. You might not like those dissident views, But you've got to recognise that that is, as I argued, a conservative position. That means that change is not possible. I don't even understand how anyone in this debate, by the way, thinks anyone changes their mind. I mean, are we giving up on everyone, right? Is that it? I mean, do you just say, oh, he's a racist, that's it, doomed forever? I mean, talk about it. Are we never going to try and persuade anyone of anything ever again? Is that the point here? Because unless you argue with people, then there's only one view. And if there's only one view, this is the final point of human civilization. We can never progress. Well, bloody hell, I'm not doing that. I think we've got a long way to go at improving things myself.
I'd like to just come to Matthew Sullivan on this, and then I'll go to you, Ella. Matthew, you said you had a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, so I think that there is this notion that a company refusing you access to their social media platform somehow violates your right to freedom of speech.
I didn't say
this
that.
Is ludicrous. This is utterly ludicrous, and I'd thank you not to interrupt me, please. A company who owns a platform has the right to dictate a terms of service, and when you violate that terms of service, they have the right to refuse you access to that platform. And if you don't like it, you can build your own platform. If you have a large group of people who think like you, then you can buy a server and host a social media platform. This is a thing that people do. There are myriad forums among the internet where you can go onto them and talk to people who have the same views as you. You do not need to go to Twitter. You do not need to go to Facebook. If you violate their terms of service, you can go somewhere else. And you also don't need to host your servers on some other big company like Amazon or AWS. And they also have the right to refuse you service, by the way, if you violate their terms of use, which Parler did, which is why they were banned. So essentially what I'm saying here is, if you don't like the fact that somebody is refusing you access to their stage, you can just build your own stage and speak from that stage. And anybody who wants to listen to you can come and listen. Your right to freedom of speech is not being restricted here in any way, because the government is not preventing you from building a stage and speaking from it.
Thank you, Matthew. Ella, you had your hand up.
It's just it's a really small point, but I think an important one. It's, you know, the idea that even me in my, like, I'm not exactly a tech Luddite. The idea that me, or like my 65-year-old father, or, you know, their guy that works in the corner shop round the corner could build their own platform tomorrow and, you know, challenge the dominance of Twitter or Facebook and be able to have an equal share is, I mean, you used the word ludicrous. It's actually elitist. I mean, I want to really challenge this idea that we're just taking it as a given that universities should be a business that students come and get a service from. I mean, this is what students my age were arguing against, you know, that the whole commercialization of education means that you end up in this really rather grotesque situation in which the value of your student experience is based on how safe you feel, what protocols they're in, and what value for money you get, rather than it being this exciting, challenging place that everyone in society should have access to. I mean, like it or not, especially during the pandemic as it happens, Twitter and Facebook has become the public square, because, I mean, in the pandemic, quite literally, there is no public square that exists legally. But even before then, this is where politicians spend most of their time. This is where policies get discussed. This is where campaigns get enacted. You know, everyone talks about the fact that the clipboard is a thing of a past and that stalls don't happen anymore, that people do these kind of politics happens online. And so, you know, call me a flippin' bleeding heart lefty, but the idea that you would just succumb to the dominance of, be it big tech, or the idea of big business, Parler or whatever, or Twitter or whatever it is, having the controls or the monopoly over what gets to be said in society is ludicrous. And if it comes to the government, there is huge swathes of really, well, I think, quite dangerous and illiberal speech laws coming in. For example, the criminalisation of misogyny, the criminalisation of various other things as hate speech, that essentially squashes, more often than not, squashes working class people, ordinary people's ability to access the resources to create platforms, to create places where speech is enacted. What you're arguing for, it sounds like, is that if you have political power and you have the backing of wealth and resources to be able to get yourself your own space, then fine. But if you're a little person, and actually lots of students who go to university, it might be the 3 years that they have access to the resources or the space or the time to put on some interesting political debates, because afterwards they'll have to clock off to a crappy job, as degrees don't get you much these days anymore. And you're telling me that student union representatives on their high horse are going to get to say to them, no, you're not allowed to do that. I mean, come on, let's have some big sky thinking here. Let's not give in to the kind of commercialization of the public space so willingly. It's giving me the creeps, actually.
Thank you, Anna. We'll quickly go to Jamie and then Ciara.
Yeah, just to come back, I think I get the notion from listening to Matthew that what he actually wants is for social media platforms such as Twitter to essentially be liberal left-wing echo chambers, hyper woke, where everybody's views are there's a standard which some liberal standard bearers have decided which views are acceptable. Everybody must get on board with that, and if they don't, they should be banned or told to go and set up their own platform. And I would just say that's solely self-defeating for the proponents of that, because ultimately the mob will eat itself, because whenever you have nobody else to try and deplatform, all of a sudden you'll start deplatforming people you'd previously actually agreed with. So deplatforming will perpetuate itself. And just on the Donald Trump and Twitter, there's been a lot of talk about standards in these private companies, but the issue is the standards aren't applied equally across the board. They're applied for political purposes. And I tweeted on the night that Donald Trump was deplatformed. I think it was on 5 Live about this, and there was a prominent public figure who effectively called for Donald Trump to be beheaded. Of course, he wasn't banned off Twitter, and in fact, many of the people that was calling for Donald Trump to be deplatformed were retweeting and liking this and thinking this was fabulous. And just on a very quick final point, we see this on social media in Northern Ireland, where we have, and I call them, and I think it's accurate enough, effectively a coalition of crackpots who get together online to troll and abuse people, but yet it's the very same people who then preach and talk about how other people should be deplatformed. So I think it's the absolute hypocrisy in a lot of all of this. If people want to have a standard, well, let's have the standard and let's apply the same standard across the board. But the problem with the proposition tonight, and in fact the people who support deplatforming, is they don't actually want a standard across the board. What they actually mean is they want people they agree with to be amplified and people they disagree with to be deplatformed, and that's what it's actually all about.
Thank you, Jamie. Ciara, you had a point that you wanted to raise.
Right, so here's the thing about Donald Trump. He literally broke their terms of service. So it's the kind of thing that the argument essentially is we should let him keep on that platform, even though he literally went against the rules that he agreed to when he signed up for it. And to be fair, I do take Jamie's point that we do need more universal application of these rules, but it doesn't mean that we should just let Donald Trump get away with actually breaking the service themselves. Trust me, I want it to be more across the board. And second of all, I do disagree with the point that essentially this means you don't hear views you don't agree with, or you don't hear right-wing views. I myself am part of a debating society. I would say I'm about center left, but the thing is, I have listened to so many right-wing views. I have argued right-wing views because I have done many debates that I do not agree with. A couple of weeks ago, I did a debate on the death penalty, and I argued for a side that I personally don't really believe in. Trust me, I have done many controversial debates. I have heard many controversial opinions. I have heard many views from both sides of the spectrum, and never once have I had to heard, as I said in my speech, never once have I had to hear a genuinely racist, homophobic, or sectarian comment, because there are rules for that in our society. You can't go out and say that and genuinely say it. And that's what I mean. There's rules in there for a reason. And if I broke those rules, I would rightfully be deplatformed or told to basically stop speaking or leave because I broke those rules. So, yeah, that's essentially my point.
Thank you, Ciara. And before we come to Claire, I'd just like to go back to Matthew. This was your initial point, and do you have any response to some of the criticisms that have been made?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. This is a topic that I love talking about because I'm a software engineering student, so I love talking about, the internet. I really feel like it's hilarious that we have these right-wing people who suddenly, now that big tech is censoring people on their platforms, are now against the idea of having a free market. And this is one of the very few times where I think a free market is really useful, because there's no reason why, if you're a right-wing person who thinks that your views are being censored on Facebook, there's no reason why you should allow Facebook to have a monopoly in social media. Like, in the decades before these giant social media platforms, do you know what people did? They hosted a server and people connected to it, and then they just talked, and they talked about their views. So there is literally nothing stopping you, if you want to have a platform with different terms of service to Twitter or Facebook, from just building a platform that has those terms. I see you, Ella, like rubbing your fingers as if this is like a money-making thing. It doesn't even have to cost money, right? Yes, people do have to spend money on buying network infrastructure, but like, finance it the same way literally any social media company finances their servers. Put ads on it. Do any of the other things that get you money on social media networks. And this is one of the few areas where a free market actually works really well. If you want people to go to your platform with a different terms of service, where you can censor whoever you like. You can choose not to let people talk about left-wing ideas if you want. You can choose to let people say hate speech, which is what Twitter refuses to let you do, because Twitter does let you say right-wing ideas, which is why Jamie Bryson is still on Twitter. The only thing Twitter doesn't let you do is like incite violence, which is why they banned Donald Trump for inciting violence. So essentially what I'm trying to get at here is that, again, the idea that someone refusing to lend you their microphone violates your freedom of speech is absurd. Twitter has the right to not publish your content, and you do not have the right to compel them to publish your content, just as you have the right to publish whatever content you want on a platform that you create. And if you want to create a platform, if you think that there is a demand for such a platform, just make it. People will go to it.
Thank you, Matthew.
It's really that simple.
Thank you. Claire, you've been wanting to make a comment on this.
I'm a bit frustrated. That's the understatement of that night, about how disingenuous this discussion is becoming. I mean, first of all, my attack on big tech is not because I'm right-wing, because I'm not right-wing. So there's an assumption that, for a start off, right? I'm on the left, if you want to know, right? That's the first thing. But of course, I don't conform to what apparently some people think is the left, so that doesn't work, because we're all in boxes, aren't we? That's the first thing. And secondly, I'm delighted, I think it's Ciara who said, she's been at loads of debates and she's never heard all these right-wing horrendous views, and why should she? But the assumption might be that, we're all basically gutter, racist, really. And as soon as you let us out, everyone's going to come out with all this stuff. The truth is, the vast majority of people just want to be able to discuss and debate. And the good thing about being part of a debating society is you get to hear all views. Very good. That's what society should be like. That's what the public square is like, right? You let people have the debates and they cope with hearing different opinions. We're simply suggesting that your debating society should be like the public square, should be like writ large. And guess what would happen? People would be better informed. And then they'd realise that actually people are not knuckle-dragging, racist, backward lunatics, which is some kind of mythical image of what's going on out there, which I think it's almost like frightening. If only we had free speech, you'd discover that all these people were, fascists everywhere you looked, and so on and so forth. I just think that is a wrong thing. And the final thing, which is also driving me mad, is can everybody stop saying you lot want to you keep complaining about not having your voices heard? First of all, I went out of my way to not say that. I don't think anyone has said that. It's about who gets to listen. And I was called naive earlier. That's a first for me. It has to be said. I mean, I've been called all sorts of things because I mentioned free speech and fighting slavery. Apparently that was naive. But if I can quote an ex-slave, Frederick Douglass, who made the point, to suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. And the reason I'm saying that is because that's what it's all about. It's what you get to hear. It's who decides what you get to hear. And my objection, it doesn't matter whether it's Twitter, I don't care about the big tech thing, is why should people in power of a student union, of the government, or of Twitter get to decide what you or I hear? We should be open to hearing everything. And that's where you gain some power, or rather, power is taken away from you if somebody else decides on your behalf that something's too offensive, dangerous, or hateful to hear. That's a very dangerous, powerless situation to be in.
Thank you. Now, we said we'd be wrapped up by 8 p.m. It's now nearly 8:30. We've really enjoyed it. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying thank you to all of our guests, especially our students as well, who've come and debated alongside you all. Thank you to everyone that's been watching on Facebook or any of our other platforms. And thanks to everyone that's got involved by asking questions, contributing, or debating. This will now go to a public Twitter poll on our Twitter account. People are welcome to share that and contribute on that and vote. That will be up there for 24 hours. And after that, we will publish the results of the vote there on this motion. This House supports no platforming. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for attending. And it's a good night from us. Bye-bye.